Houston, Texas. What would you do if your entire future was on the line because of a lie? Xavier Mitchell sat in the courtroom, his hands balled into fists beneath the table. The polished wood gleamed under the bright fluorescent lights, the air thick with murmurs from the audience. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to look at Andrew Collins, the boy who had put him here. He wasn't supposed to be in this situation. At 14, Xavier had his future planned out. Straight A's, captain of the robotics team, dreams of attending MIT. He worked hard, stayed out of trouble, and avoided drama. But none of that mattered today, because today he wasn't being recognized for his achievements. He was being accused of something he didn't do. Andrew Collins sat on the witness stand, his lower lip trembling as he recounted the supposed attack. His right eye was still bruised, a stark contrast against his pale skin. I was walking to class when Xavier cornered me," Andrew stammered, glancing toward his parents, who sat in the front row. "He punched me. He said I didn't belong here." Xavier clenched his jaw. "Lies." His lawyer stood. "Mr. Collins, do you have any proof that my client hit you?" Andrew hesitated. He was the only one there, he said weakly. The courtroom murmured. Xavier's mother placed a comforting hand on his arm. He could feel the tension radiating from her, the silent plea for strength. She knew the truth. So did he. But would the court care? The judge tapped his gavel. Quiet in the courtroom. Andrew's lawyer stepped forward. "Your Honor, my client has suffered both physically and emotionally from this assault. The school has already taken action by suspending Mr. Mitchell, but we are here today to ensure accountability." Accountability? Xavier almost laughed. This wasn't about accountability. This was about power. Andrew Collins wasn't just any student. His parents were major donors to the school, high-profile, wealthy figures with influence, the kind of people who got what they wanted, no matter the cost. And right now, what they wanted was a guilty verdict. Xavier swallowed hard. No one had believed him when he said he never touched Andrew. His word didn't matter against a family like theirs. But as he sat there, staring at the people who wanted to see him fail, he made a decision. He wasn't going down without a fight. Taking a deep breath, he met the judge's gaze. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I have something to say." Xavier Mitchell had never been in trouble a day in his life. He followed the rules, worked hard, and stayed focused on his future. But none of that mattered the moment Andrew Collins pointed at him and screamed, "Xavier, hit me!" The entire classroom went silent. Their teacher, Ms. Reynolds, rushed forward. "Andrew, what happened?" Andrew clutched his cheek, his bottom lip trembling. His right eye was swollen and dark. "He punched me," he whimpered. "He was mad that I won." Xavier's mouth fell open. "What? That's not true." But no one was listening. The day before, Xavier had won first place in the school's science fair, a competition Andrew had been certain he would win. His project had dazzled the judges, earning him recognition from the principal, and even a letter of recommendation for a summer STEM program. Andrew had barely shaken his hand before storming off, his face red with anger. Now, less than 24 hours later, he stood in front of the class, playing the victim. And Xavier, he was the villain. Security was called. Teachers didn't ask questions. They didn't check for witnesses. They didn't even let Xavier explain. Within minutes, he was being dragged out of the classroom, handcuffs tight around his wrists. His classmates whispered, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. But no one spoke up. Outside, Xavier's mother arrived just as they were loading him into a police car. "What is going on?" she cried, running toward him. Mrs. Mitchell was a woman of quiet strength, always the calm in the storm. But now her face was tight with fear. "My son is not a bully," she shouted at the principal, who stood with arms crossed, his face unreadable. "The school has a zero-tolerance policy for violence," Principal Harris said coolly. "We have to take every allegation seriously." "But you didn't even investigate," Mrs. Mitchell protested. "There were multiple witnesses," Harris replied, though he wouldn't say who. "Andrew's family is already pressing charges." Xavier's stomach twisted. This couldn't be happening. Andrew's parents were major donors to the school. They had the kind of influence that could bend rules, that could turn lies into truth. And right now, they were using that power to destroy him. Mrs. Mitchell turned to Xavier, her eyes filled with both love and panic. "Don't say a word," she told him firmly. "We're going to fight this." But deep down, Xavier knew what they were up against. The school had already made up its mind. He was guilty in their eyes. But what they didn't know? Xavier had the proof to expose the real bully, and he wasn't going down without a fight. The courtroom was packed, filled with anxious whispers and judgmental stares. Reporters sat in the back, their cameras ready to capture every moment. School officials, teachers, and parents lined the seats, watching closely as if this was just another school assembly. But for Xavier Mitchell, this was no ordinary day. This was a fight for his future. Andrew Collins sat at the plaintiff's table, his parents on either side of him. He dabbed at his dry eyes with a tissue, playing the part of the innocent victim. His mother's hand rested protectively on his shoulder, while his father glared at Xavier as if he were already convicted. The prosecutor rose, adjusting his suit before stepping toward the jury. "This is a simple case," he said smoothly. "The defendant, Xavier Mitchell, assaulted Andrew Collins in an unprovoked attack, leaving him with visible injuries. There is no doubt about his guilt." Xavier felt his mother squeeze his hand under the table. Her grip was firm, grounding him. She believed in him. That was all that mattered. His lawyer, Ms. Torres, stood. "Your Honor, my client has been falsely accused, and we intend to prove it." The judge, an older man with sharp eyes, turned to Xavier. "Mr. Mitchell, tell the court your side of the story." Xavier's heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. "I never touched Andrew." A few murmurs rippled through the audience, but the judge raised a hand for silence. "Then how do you explain his injuries?" Xavier took a deep breath. His moment had come. "I can show you." Gasps filled the room. Andrew stiffened in his seat. His parents exchanged nervous glances. Even the prosecutor hesitated. Xavier reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He turned to the judge. "With your permission, I'd like to submit video evidence." The courtroom held its breath, because in that moment, Xavier had just changed everything. The courtroom fell into a tense silence. All eyes were on Xavier as he held up his phone, his hand steady, despite the weight of the moment. "Your Honor," his lawyer, Ms. Torres, said, "we have new evidence that directly contradicts the prosecution's claims." The judge adjusted his glasses. "Proceed." Ms. Torres approached the court clerk and handed over a USB drive. Within moments, the screen at the front of the courtroom lit up with a security video from the school hallway. The footage played, showing Andrew Collins entering the boys' bathroom alone. Seconds later, the courtroom gasped as the screen showed something no one had expected. Andrew Collins staring at his reflection before suddenly punching himself in the face. Whispers erupted across the courtroom. Reporters scribbled frantically. Andrew's parents sat frozen, their faces pale. The video continued, showing Andrew pausing, shaking out his hand, and then punching himself again, harder this time. He stumbled back, inspected his reflection, and nodded as if satisfied before leaving the bathroom. Ms. Torres turned to the jury. This footage was taken at the same time that Xavier Mitchell was in robotics club across campus. The prosecutor paled. This doesn't prove anything," he stammered, his confidence slipping. Ms. Torres arched a brow. "It proves that my client couldn't have possibly been responsible for Andrew's injury." She paused for a moment before delivering the final blow. "It proves that Andrew Collins framed Xavier." The judge raised a hand. "Silence in the courtroom," he commanded as murmurs broke out among the spectators. He turned to Andrew, his expression sharp. "Do you have an explanation?" Andrew swallowed hard, his gaze darting toward his parents. His father's jaw was clenched, his mother's hands curled into fists. "Well?" the judge pressed. Andrew opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face turned bright red as the weight of the truth settled over him. He had no excuse, no escape. The entire courtroom had just watched his lie unravel before their eyes. His father finally stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Andrew," he said through gritted teeth, "tell them the truth." The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers. Xavier sat still, his breath slow and steady, as he watched the prosecutor shift uncomfortably. The once confident lawyer, who had been so sure of his case, was now scrambling for words. We were unaware of this footage," the prosecutor stammered, his face turning red. Xavier's mother shot up from her seat. "You never even investigated. You wanted my son to take the blame." Principal Harris, the man who had suspended Xavier without a second thought, adjusted his tie. His once firm stance seemed to waver as the weight of the accusations pressed down on him. "We acted on the information given to us," he said, his voice strained. Xavier's lawyer, Ms. Torres, didn't let up. She crossed her arms. "No, you acted to protect your biggest donor's son." Andrew Collins's parents sat stiffly, their faces pale as the truth unraveled before them. Andrew shrank in his chair, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The judge sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. This case was built on false accusations. His voice was firm, carrying a weight that made the room fall silent. He turned his sharp gaze to Andrew's parents. "Your son has wasted the court's time and nearly destroyed an innocent student's future." Andrew flinched. His father's jaw clenched, his mother burying her face in her hands. They had done everything to protect their son's reputation, and now that same reputation was in ruins. The judge wasn't finished. He turned to the prosecutor. "I want an investigation into how this school handles discrimination cases, effective immediately." A stunned silence filled the room. Xavier felt his mother's grip on his hand tighten. He glanced at her, seeing the mixture of relief and lingering pain in her eyes. She had fought for him. She had never stopped believing in him. And now the truth was out. The school, the system that had been so quick to turn against him, was now under scrutiny. For the first time, Xavier saw the power of truth, and he had just exposed a system that never wanted to hear it. The courtroom was silent as the judge looked over the room, his expression unreadable. He took a deep breath and cleared his throat. "The charges against Xavier Mitchell are dropped immediately." The tension shattered. Cheers erupted from the back of the courtroom. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing as they captured the moment. Xavier sat frozen for a moment, his brain struggling to catch up with the words he had just heard. His mother grabbed him in a tight embrace, her shoulders shaking. "You fought back, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Xavier exhaled, feeling years older than he was. "I had to." The judge raised his gavel, commanding silence once more. The courtroom slowly settled, though the energy remained electric. "Furthermore," he continued, "this court strongly suggests that the school board reconsider its leadership. The handling of this case was deeply flawed, and I expect changes to be made." The school principal, who had sat stiffly throughout the proceedings, suddenly looked small. His face was pale, his hands wringing together as if searching for an explanation. Xavier glanced at Andrew Collins, who sat motionless beside his parents. His face was downcast, his fingers curled into his lap. His father's jaw was tight, his mother's face a mask of shock. And then, the biggest twist of all unfolded. Reporters uncovered emails showing that Andrew's parents had attempted to bribe the school board, a desperate effort to keep their son's name out of the news, to bury the scandal before it spread. They had offered thousands of dollars in donations in exchange for silence. It didn't work. By the next morning, the emails had leaked. The story went viral, dominating headlines. The once respected Collins family was now the face of corruption, privilege, and deceit. Xavier watched it all unfold with a strange mix of relief and disbelief. He had spent weeks fighting for the truth, and now the world finally saw it. But despite it all, he didn't feel victorious. He felt tired. His mother placed a hand on his back as they stepped outside the courthouse. The cameras followed, flashing like firecrackers. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's go home." Xavier nodded, inhaling the fresh air deeply. Justice had been served. But what happened next? That stunned everyone. Days after the trial, the school held an emergency board meeting. The pressure from the media and community had become too great to ignore. Parents demanded accountability. Students spoke out about their own experiences with discrimination. The truth could no longer be buried. The meeting ended with the announcement that the principal had resigned. A new set of policies was introduced: stronger protections against racial discrimination, mandatory bias training for staff, and an independent review board for disciplinary actions. It was a small step, but it was change. And Xavier, he received an official apology from the school board. It was read aloud at an assembly, where every student and teacher had to listen as they admitted their failure. Standing in front of the school, reporters swarmed Xavier with questions. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward him. "What's next for you?" a reporter asked. Xavier took a deep breath, standing tall. "I'm going to keep doing what I love, science, robotics, and standing up for the truth." The words felt natural. He had fought for himself, for his future, and for every student who had been silenced before him. His mother stood beside him, pride shining in her eyes. She pulled him into a tight embrace. "Your father would be so proud." Xavier glanced up at the sky, a bittersweet smile on his lips. He could almost hear his dad's voice reminding him to stay strong, to keep pushing forward. "I know," he whispered. The battle had been won, but Xavier knew this was just the beginning. That day, he hadn't just cleared his name. He had started a revolution.